Beneath the sands of Egypt lies a ghost city, a place frozen in time, whispering secrets of a pharaoh's ambition and a revolution that shook the very foundations of an empire. Picture magnificent temples and palaces rising from the desert, bustling with life and activity. Then, envision the winds of change sweeping through, leaving behind empty streets, echoing halls, and the remnants of a dream turned to dust. What led to this dramatic downfall? What mysteries still lie buried beneath the sands? Amarna is the current Arabic name for the ancient Egyptian city of Akhetaten, which was the country's capital under the reign of Akhenaten, who ruled from 1353 to 1336 BC. The site is officially known as Tel El Amarna, after the Beni Amran tribe that lived in the region at the time of discovery. In archaeology, a tell is a mound formed by the remnants of consecutive human occupancy in the same place over a specific number of years. As each new generation builds on the remains of the preceding one, their structures climb in height, forming an artificial hill. Amarna differs from the typical tell in that it was not destroyed by a foreign power or earthquake and was never rebuilt in antiquity. Instead, it was destroyed by order of the pharaoh Horemheb, who wanted to erase Akhenaten's name and accomplishments from history. Its ruins then lay on the plain by the Nile River for centuries before being gradually built on by others who lived nearby. When the pharaoh Akhenaten came to power, he was a strong king who, like other rulers, was responsible for maintaining Ma'at, harmony and balance, in the kingdom. Ma'at was the culture's primary value, allowing all parts of life to work smoothly and properly. It existed from the beginning of creation. Hence, a king's observance and preservation of Ma'at depended greatly on correct deity adoration via ancient ceremonies and rituals. Although Akhenaten originally followed this approach, by the 5th year of his reign, he had destroyed the old Egyptian religion, closed the temples, and forced his own monotheistic worldview on the people. This change damaged the Egyptian economy, which was primarily reliant on temples, diverted the king's attention away from foreign affairs, stalled the military, and resulted in Egypt's major loss of standing among neighboring countries. Akhenaten did not create the deity he selected to replace the others. Achten was already known amongst the Egyptians as a minor solar god who symbolized the sun's radiance. According to Egyptologist David Silverman, all Akhenaten did was raise this deity to the status of a supreme being and attach to him the traits formerly connected with Amun, while retaining none of that god's personal features. Silverman goes on to say, unlike traditional deities, this god could not be depicted. The symbol of the sun disk with rays dominating Amarna art is nothing more than a large-scale version of the hieroglyph for light. Akhenaten's one true deity was light, namely the light of the sun, which sustains all life. Unlike the other gods, Achten was beyond human worries and without human infirmities. As Akhenaten describes in his great hymn to the Achten, his deity could not feel envious, unhappy, furious, or act on impulse. He just existed, causing all else to exist. A deity this strong and awe-inspiring could not be worshipped in any other god's repurposed temple or in any city that had previously seen the devotion of other deities. He demanded a new city created especially for the respect and adoration of Aten. This city was called Akhetaten, and it was established halfway between the ancient capitals of Memphis in the north and Thebes in the south. Akhenaten chose a location that was unoccupied by any gods, goddesses, male or female rulers or people. Boundary steles, or slabs of stones used to mark the borders, were placed at regular intervals around Akhetaten's circumference. These steles contained the story of the city's history and founding. Other steles and inscriptions make it obvious that Akhenaten founded the city wholly on his own initiative, rather than as an official commission of the monarchy of Egypt. A pharaoh of the new kingdom of Egypt would issue a commission to construct a city or temple, or to erect obelisks or monuments in his royal name and for the glory of his specific deity. But these projects were intended to serve the country as a whole, not just the monarch. Akhenaten's city was erected only to serve as an extravagant holy precinct for his deity. What did this city look like? What was life like there? Akhetaten was spread out across 4 miles on the east bank of the Nile, between the coast and the cliffs above Asyut. Some border stelaes were cut directly into the cliffs, while others stood free on the city's far side. The 4 major districts we now know as North City, Central City, Southern Suburbs, and Outskirts, although none of these names were used to refer to the locations at the time. The North City was built around the Northern Palace, where visitors were welcomed and Akhten was venerated. The royal family dwelt in apartments in the back of the palace, and the most lavish halls, painted with outdoor images depicting the fertility of the Delta area, were devoted to Akhten, who was considered to reside there. As a welcome to Aten, the palace had no roof, which was usual among Akhetaten constructions. The central city was planned around the Great Temple and the small temple of Aten. This was the city's bureaucratic hub, where administrators worked and resided. The rich elite lived in the southern suburbs, which were known for their enormous estates and monuments. Peasant farmers who worked in the fields and on the necropolis graves inhabited the surrounding areas. The border steles of Akhenaten reveal that he planned the city exclusively for Akhten and refused to accept input from anyone else, including his wife, Nefertiti. It is unclear what type of ideas she may have offered, but the fact that Akhenaten makes a point of not listening to her advice suggests they were substantial. According to Egyptologist Stephen Snape, the prospectus for the new city carved on the boundary steles focuses on providing for the king, his family, the god Aten, and religious officials involved in the Aten cult. It is also clear that it completely overlooks the demands of the great majority of Amarna's residents, who would have been relocated, perhaps unwillingly, from their homes to live in the new metropolis. After relocating his capital to Akhetaten, Akhenaten prioritized worshipping Akhten above state concerns and the declining status of the kingdom. How do we know all this about Akhenaten and his reign? Do we have any proof? Over 3,200 years later in 1887, while digging for fertilizer in Amarna, or modern-day Akhetaten, a local woman discovered cuneiform tablets. Upon examination and translation by Egyptologists, the tablets were found to date back to the 14th century BC. They contained communications between Egyptian rulers and those of other countries, as well as official papers from the time period. Eventually called the Amarna letters, the bulk of these letters show that Akhenaten was an effective administrator when a situation piqued his attention, but that as his reign advanced, he became more disinterested in his monarchical obligations. In one letter, he sharply criticizes the foreign monarch Abdiashirta for his activities against the slain monarch Ribadi. In another letter, he discusses his relationship with the Hittites, Egypt's adversaries at the time. Instead of any sense of retribution for Ribadi's murder and the capture of Byblos, his motivation was most likely a desire to maintain cordial ties with the Abdi Ashirta-influenced buffer kingdoms between Egypt and the land of the Hatti, such as Canaan and Syria. There is no question that his attention to this matter helped the interests of the state, but since other comparable situations were overlooked, it seems that he only decided to handle topics that touched him directly. Akhenaten had Abdiashirta hauled to Egypt and imprisoned for a year until Hittite advances in the north forced his release. Although there seems to be a significant difference between his letters dealing with this problem and other kings writing on comparable topics. While there are instances of Akhenaten overseeing state matters, there are many more that demonstrate his indifference for everything other than his religious reforms and royal life. It should be emphasized, however, that this is an issue that is often and heatedly discussed among historians in the present day, as is the whole Amarna period of Akhenaten's reign. Dr. Zahi Hawass writes, "More has been written on this period in Egyptian history than any other, and scholars have been known to come to blows, or at least to major episodes of impoliteness over their conflicting opinions. The majority of evidence, both from the Amarna letters and Tutankhamun's later decree, as well as archaeological indications, strongly suggests that Akhenaten was a very poor ruler in terms of his subjects and vassal states." Hawass said his reign was an inward-focused regime that had lost interest in its foreign policy. Akhenaten considered himself and his wife not just as God's servants, but also embodiments of Aten's light. Some people have referred to the royal family's unnaturally elongated and thin appearance in period art as realism, but it is much more likely symbolic. To Akhenaten, the deity Aten was unlike any other, unseen, all-powerful, omniscient, and transformational, and the art of the time would seem to reflect this idea in the strangely tall and skinny figures depicted. They have been altered by the touch of Aten. But Akhenaten's city, the glorious homage to the sun god, was doomed. Pharaoh Akhenaten died in 1353 BC, and, after a short interim rule by another of his son Tutankhaten assumed the throne. Shortly after his coronation, Tutankhaten changed his name to Tutankhamun, repealed his father's prescriptions, and returned Egypt to traditional religious practices. He moved the capital from the city of Akhetaten back to Thebes and reopened the temples. Although his reign lasted only 10 years and he died at 19, Tutankhamun's efforts to bring Egypt back to its former balance would have meant a great deal to the people of the land. The Egyptian concept of Ma'at, of eternal balance, was thought to be maintained by the people's cooperation in the work of the gods. In abandoning those gods, it was thought, Akhenaten had brought imbalance to the land, and it was this balance that Tutankhamun sought to restore. When Tutankhamun died with no heir, his close advisor and military leader, the vizier Ai, succeeded to the throne. Ai first ordered a ceremonial marriage to Tutankhamun's young widow, Ankhesenamun, and officiated the royal funeral of Tutankhamun. This official marriage was considered necessary in order to maintain balance, Ma'at again, but it was not an actual marriage. It was assumed, however, that Ankhesenamun would marry Ai in order to legitimize his claim to the throne and again ensure balance in the land. Shortly after the funeral, Ankhesenamun wrote to the Hittite king Suppiluliuma I, asking him to send one of his sons to be her husband instead. She refused to marry Ai, who may have been her grandfather, and instead wanted a husband of royal blood whom she could consider an equal. Suppiluliuma was suspicious at first, but after Ankhesenamun's assurances, sent his son Zananza. However, the prince was murdered before reaching the Egyptian border, and this assassination has long been thought to be the work of Egypt's military general Horemheb. Ai ruled for 3 years, and having no heir at his death, Horemheb then took the throne. While Ai had continued Tutankhamun's return to traditional religious practices, Horemheb would go much further, and it is these policies for which he is most remembered. Horemheb ascended the throne around 1320 BC, and, according to the historian Margaret Bunson, he marked his reign with extensive programs to restore order and rebuild Egypt's decimated shrines. Tributes flowed into the land during his reign, and lesser city-states and nations sent delegations to keep cordial relations with him. He was called stern by contemporaries. Claiming that the gods, specifically Horus of Hutsenu, his patron god, had chosen him to bring balance back to the land, Horemheb instituted a strict orthodoxy concerning traditional religious practice. Horemheb destroyed Akhenaten's city of Akhetaten entirely and moved the capital of Egypt from Thebes to Memphis in order to distance himself from anything that had to do with the rulers of the Amarna period. The monuments, temples, and stelae that had been erected by his immediate predecessors were torn down, stones and brick tumbled to the ground, and their materials used as fill in constructing new buildings. Just as Akhenaten had ordained that all signs of the old gods should be erased from the landscape of Egypt, Horemheb proclaimed that all reference to Akhenaten's chosen religion and god, Aten, be obliterated. He set about erasing Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and from history by removing all statues of them and carving his own history onto the backs of stelaes depicting the three pharaohs. So successful was he in this goal that later Egyptians came to believe that Horemheb himself was the direct successor of Amenhotep III, Akhenaten's father, and no one had ascended the throne in between. Egyptians simply believed that Horemheb had just continued his father's policies. Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and were forgotten by history so completely that it was not until they surfaced in excavations in the late 19th and mid-20th centuries that it was known they had ever existed. How did Akhetaten get discovered? Who was the first person to see the remains of this magnificent city? Claude Sicard, a French priest, was the first to plan and depict the city's remains in the 18th century AD. Following the discovery of the Amarna letters, several Europeans paid visits to the site, and interest in the location grew. It was further studied and plotted by Napoleon's army of engineers during his Egyptian campaign in the late 19th century, and this effort drew the attention of other archaeologists. Once the Rosetta Stone was decoded, and ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics could be read in around 1824. Akhenaten's name was recognized then, but not his importance. Today, the site is a vast, desolate expanse of damaged foundations that the Amarna project is preserving and excavating. Unlike the remains of Thebes or the settlement of Deir el-Medina, there is little left for visitors to see in Akhetaten. According to Egyptologist Stephen Snape, apart from the modest reconstructions of parts of the city by modern archaeologists, there is virtually nothing to be seen of Akhetaten. This is hardly surprising given that the towns of Memphis and Per-Ramesses, both of which were ancient Egyptian capitals as well as many others, are now essentially empty lots with significantly fewer antiquities than those at Akhetaten. Akhetaten is unique in this aspect since the city was destroyed by the heir of the pharaoh who created it, rather than by time or an invading army. No other time in ancient Egypt's history has a king's successor destroyed a city in an effort to obliterate his name due to a shift in official religion. To take one's name from a temple, monument, or tomb was to sentence them forever, but in this case, Horemheb's sense of justice could only be satisfied by destroying the entire city. The Egyptians believed that one needed to leave a lasting impression on the living in order to continue one's journey in the afterlife, which explains their love of carvings, hieroglyphs, pyramids, statues, and stelaes to record the accomplishments of their rulers. In the case of the city of Akhetaten, not only temples, steles, and recorded history were destroyed, but also the records of the reigns and lives of Tutankhamun, Akhenaten, and As we come to the end of our journey exploring the city of Akhetaten, let's take a moment to think about the story of a city that's no longer here. It's tragic to consider the artifacts and treasures that have been lost forever, but it teaches us important things about how civilizations can disappear. Looking at the remains of this old city, we should remember to learn from the past. Thanks to the work of modern-day archaeologists and scholars and the few remaining artifacts found, the lives of Tutankhamun, Akhenaten, and have not been lost completely to history. Let us continue to preserve our history so it can continue to teach and inspire us.